Oh, sailor, have you found your perfect sea?
I want to talk about rights and entitlement. In many ways, they're synonymous concepts, though the word entitlement can often be used in a pejorative way. That is, someone thinks they're entitled to something and they have absolutely no reason to think that. So it can be, as I said, it can be used pejoratively. Rights, you don't tend to use that pejoratively. It's a claim that is made, and it's astonishing how much celebratory writing there is about the concept. That is, rights are treated as so wonderful and invaluable that there's a never-ending stream of books written on the subject, and of course rights become the source of various appeals that are made by people who feel that they are entitled to something that they have not received. So even though I have used entitlement there and rights there, the way I've paired them, that's really what a right is. A right is something that gives you an entitlement to something. Now, the concept that undergirds rights is very often the concept of human dignity. We are creatures that intrinsically have dignity. This is an idea that has a philosophical pedigree. Immanuel Kant made this argument, for example, in a number of his works. That can sound very persuasive. It certainly has a certain ring to it. But is it anything other than rhetorical? Is there really anything substantive in saying that we have rights because we have dignity? Or is it that we have rights because of certain historical processes and claims that have been made and victories that have been made in certain political contestations and struggles that rights have been bestowed? In other words, does it really have anything to do with dignity, or is dignity just part of an artifice that gives people something to hang on to make the rights sound as if they're grounded somewhere outside the historical struggles and contestations? Because if it were outside, we would in some way be beholden to deliver on certain claims. There would be a moral, to use Kant's term, a moral imperative. That imperative would, in a sense, be divine, except the people often making the claim are not making any divine claim, because very often the people who are claiming to have rights and demanding more rights are not people that believe in God at all. And yet there is this appeal, and what is the appeal to? To dignity. But dignity is what? It's what you decide to bestow on someone. And of course the way in which dignity is used in rights talk is that the bestowing is seen as natural, and we also speak of natural rights. So it's natural that we, our species, members of our species, would bestow this dignity upon another members of the species because of what? Because they are a member of the species. Forgive me, but this sounds like very circular and unconvincing reasoning. And when I read Immanuel Kant, I am absolutely unconvinced by all the moves that he makes in order to ground this idea. And at the end of the day, that's exactly what dignity is. It's an idea, but is it an idea with any substance? Now, I'm going to put this talk about rights, dignity, entitlement, and I will get to privilege as well. Another term that's part of this cluster of concepts. But before I do that, I want to talk about a theological concept. Given that we've already talked about something as if it were divine, let's talk about a doctrine that came from people that did see the world in terms of a divine creation, and that is the doctrine of original sin. And the reason I want to talk about that is because whether you believe or do not believe in God or a God or the gods, the fact is, in my opinion, original sin contains a very deep insight into the human condition. And that insight is we will all err. And closely related to that insight, in fact, I think it's intrinsically related to original sin, is what we are born into originates in sin. Now, very often the concept of original sin is being used as a way to argue the case for freedom of will. And the great theologian who makes the case for original sin, whether he makes it through convincing arguments or whether he just does it through an appeal to doctrine, is St. Augustine. But there's something of a difference between saying we're all bound to err, which I think is absolutely fundamentally true. Show me a person and I'll eventually be able to show you the flaw. I'll show you the mistakes. I'll show you the missteps. And in a later lecture, when I want to go into evil, or when I give a lecture on evil, I want to talk about the craziness that we have in our world in thinking that morality is a big enough bulwark against evil. And I think that's a fundamental mistake about how evil originates. That is, evil originates through immoral action. I don't think that's true at all. I think that may be a component. But the reality of the condition of evil comes from the various missteps, oversights, mistakes that we make and that leave residues of us in our world and shape the world in such a way that evil becomes increasingly inevitable, that some evil consequence will follow. In a sense, that's exactly what tragedy is. But I'll leave that for another lecture. But the point I want to make here is that the emphasis upon freedom of the will, again, that's a very important doctrine within Christian theology, and there are those that argue that case, St. Augustine, but there are those also who make the case, and the most famous person to make that case, I think, in relatively modern theological history is Luther, who argues that our will is completely in bondage. And it's in bondage because which is to say there is no such thing as freedom of the will. And he considered himself to be a disciple of Augustine, and considered that he could also find this argument in Augustine himself, which is interesting because there's the two sides of these these antithetical sides of this essential doctrine about why we err, why we sin, why we miss the mark. And if we go now to the Luther / bondage position, that's why I've raised that issue today when I want to speak about rights. Because to say that we live in bondage is to recognize that we do not create the world ex nihilo. We are born into a world where all these forces are in operation. And the operation of these forces are such that the past has made them. And the past, our history, the historical conditions under which other actors have played themselves out, or other people have acted, have created all sorts of institutions, practices, behaviours, ways of being in the world, pathways of being in the world, our language. And we fit into that. We did not make that. We fit into that. We don't have any right to that. We are, in a sense, condemned to that. What we do with that, we do not really know. But what we do with that is what we're capable of doing with that. And what we're capable of, that's partly due to us, but it's also to how we've been cultivated through the historical institutions that have made us. So we can't really extricate ourselves from that. We can try to do things differently. We can learn from that. But we are born into it. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger talked of us being thrown into it. And I think that's quite an apt metaphor. We're thrown into it. But if we're thrown into it, I want to use another metaphor. We grow from it. That is the condition of our growth. That's the condition of what we are. The pathways of our possibility have been preformed in that way. Now, what has that got to do with rights? It's got everything to do with rights, and it's got everything to do with entitlement. Because, hold that again, and now I'm going to make another step. When we're claiming a right, we're claiming that someone can do something for us. A right is not just a claim to be left alone. A right is also a claim that something in us, a part of us, a demand from us, be recognised. In fact, that's really what a right is. A right is a demand. It's a demand. If that demand cannot be met, it's meaningless. Now, under certain conditions, we would just see rights talk as completely meaningless. If I'm alone within nature, I can't claim a right against the lion that's going to attack me or the shark that's going to eat me in the water. It's not going to listen. It's indifferent to my claim. When I am with other human beings, I can make a demand that they comply with my right. Now, some of those rights can be complied with relatively easily. I may, for example, demand that I be allowed to speak, that I have the right to freedom of speech. And that requires very little on their part. Though, of course, under certain conditions, and we live in an age where the right of free speech is actually being vociferously attacked to protect other rights, which is very interesting, because what happens as the number of rights grows is there's an entanglement of conflicting ends and conflicting desires, which pull us apart in our claims. So, when we're together with other people, we can make those rights. We can, lay claim to certain things that require very little action. But as I said, even freedom of speech, when the pitch of interaction between peoples is aflame, when it's very high, when the contestations are great, when the severity of a certain way of speaking is perceived by some as such a threat and is so dangerous, even something that would seem to be very easy to grant may be very difficult to grant. Or let's take something else, the right to education. There's a whole stack of rights which have been laid out in the Universal Declaration, part of the United Nations. In a sense, it's a founding document, but that list just kept growing and growing and growing. So there is a right to education, there's a right to medical care, there's a right to one thing after another. The question is, what does that actually mean in terms of who is giving that? So if I say I have a right to education, what I'm demanding is that someone educate me. Now, I can demand that of my parents, for example, but whether or not they've got the capacity to deliver or to do a good job is another thing. So, apart from the fact that I'm born into, I have a mother and a father, or one of them, apart from the fact that I want them to grant me the capacity so I can function in the world in education, it doesn't really amount to much if, one, they're not willing to do it, or two, they're not capable of doing it. But of course, when that demand is being made, what is really being claimed is that it is the duty of society to provide schools, education of a sort. And here the question becomes, what level? How able are the teachers? And how can I demand who must come and service that need of mine? Well, let me say that again. I can require an education, but there have to be teachers to provide that. So whose duty it is to ensure that there are teachers? Well, the argument can be made the state. Okay, but that in turn is a demand that the state be functioning sufficiently well, that there be the teachers to provide the demand. So the claim in and of itself is predicated on a certain level of wealth and resources being attained before that can be delivered. Because if I live in a society when most of our labour in that society must be expended just providing food, growing food, providing food, or protecting food, having an army, these are the most elemental sources of the division of labour. That is still a long way from having the sufficient social and economic conditions to have a group of people who will be the educators. And then what they will educate us, should they educate us in, if I demand a right to education, what should I be educated in? Weaponry? Should I be educated in how I spend my time? Should I be educated in the finer things of life, aesthetics? What should I be educated in? And of course, there's no simple answer to that, because whatever answer there is depends upon the resources available to it, the cultural patterns that are part and parcel of that particular civilization or society. So you see, the rights claim in and of itself is something that really only makes sense if it's already in practice, if there's already the conditions for there to be educators. And when you have educators and you have classes of people wanting to go into different professions or different avenues of life, and that requires an education, the educators will be there. The rights talk has really got very little to do with it. It's a political trope. But if you take that trope outside of the realm of the metaphorical and put it into the realm of the social, you see, it's only meaningful in terms of the degree of civilization that's been attained, the degree of social and economic productivity. So, if we go through numerous rights that are laid out in the Universal Declaration, you'll see that there's all sorts of reasons why half the world just ignores them. They're indifferent to them, more than half the world. And why? Because they're not affordable. They're simply not part and parcel of what can be delivered. They are, in a sense, deliverables. There's a claim, and there's the possibility of something being delivered. There's the deliverers, there's the training of these, and you see, so really what we're saying is that when I make a claim that I should be granted something, that claim is only meaningful in terms of the social level of development that we've attained. And this brings me back to original sin, because we originate in the crimes, the sins, and now I won't even say just the errors, the blood that has been spilt by our forebears. And this is the tragic circumstance. I'll move from the Christian framing now to the Greek framing of tragedy. And in some ways I think they've got a lot in common. And what they have in common is a recognition that what we do in our origin, or how we have originated, cannot be undone, and it comes with conditions the likes of which we do not see in their origin, because we only understand parts of the origin, but we do not see how it shapes the future for us. So our future has been shaped by deeds in the past. And those deeds in the past, especially those originally involving not only an initial settlement, but protection and then development, leads us to the reality that war is the fundamental condition of being human. I do not say that with any joy. I do not say that in the kind of feverish enthusiasm that people like Ernst Jünger wanted to embrace that notion. I say this is a very sad thing. I am of the party that hopes that one day war might be overcome. We are nowhere near overcoming war. But I say this because now, and I see this as pertinent now, because what I do recognise is I cannot see anyone on this planet, no matter what kind of society they come from, no matter whether they come from a tribal society and have still managed to be relatively unscathed by colonialism, which is almost, we're talking very negligible groups here, or those that have suffered terribly because of colonialism at that level, or in terms of their nation, or simply in terms of, and it really comes down to, sheer survival. Everybody alive has had forebears that have had to commit acts of violence in order to survive. Violence has been a condition of survival. To put it another way, sin has been a condition of survival. Evil has been a condition of survival. Of course, again, I'll use St. Augustine. Those that want to create more moral ways of being in the world, when confronted with the inevitability of violence, have to come up with some argument about when violence is justifiable or not. But in a sense, that's really a sad embracing of the inevitable. The inevitability is violence must be done. The way in which we dress that up through our justification, to the point I want to make, is really irrelevant. It doesn't really matter whether the violence was done justifiably or not. And the further one gets into the entanglements of justifiable violence or unjustifiable violence, the more of a mess one sees there is. Is violence unjustifiable because one perceives a threat? It's just a perception. But the perception, is it reasonable or not reasonable? Are we suggesting then that there should be a kind of elite group of philosophers that preside over every action that we do that we feel cautious about? Would they be right? Would they be capable of even understanding the reasons that we have to fear? How much knowledge of the past would they have? How good would their instincts be in guessing, in second guessing that a violent act might occur? One of the things about decisions of violence, one of the most important ingredient or aspects of deciding about violence or not is a hunch. It's nothing more than that, a hunch about whether to act or not to act is the best thing to do. I'll give you a very good example of this. Is Russia, when the Tsar was overthrown. So basically, within the first month of the Bolsheviks coming to power, they killed as many people or the first couple of months, as many people as the authorities under the Tsar, or under the leadership of the Tsar, had killed within something like 100 years. Now that would prove to be negligible. The deaths under the Soviet Union, or that occurred within the Soviet Union, the avoidable deaths, that is to say, the number of deaths that took place simply because the Bolsheviks were in power, number between 40, 60, 80 million. There's figures are bandied all over the place. Let's just say there's a lot. Had the Tsar and his authorities held on and been prepared to kill 500,000, 1 million people, that would have been avoided. Now, you see, one way of looking at what I've just said, because that's shocking, but it's true. But what is shocking is that you think there's no moral position in that. That's utilitarian. So a philosopher like Kant will argue that any moral position must be such that we must be completely indifferent to the consequences. Now, I admire Kant for one thing. He's consistent. It's idiotic what he says, but it's consistent. So he wants to leave that out altogether. So what are you left with? Well, what he says is, I'm left with the dignity of my claim. Well, bully for you. But the human condition is such where that kind of rhetorical puffery doesn't really amount to very much and is not very helpful. We have to act now. A statesman has to act on behalf of the people that statesman is representing. If that statesman gets it wrong, and there's hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths, as in the case of the Tsar. My criticism of the Tsar is not the one that the Bolsheviks and the other socialists made of how brutal the regime was. The criticism would be, he wasn't brutal enough. Now, of course, existentially, I get it. I get it why he and other autocratic figures have simply not been able to stomach the amount of violence that they've already participated in, when all seems lost, when the forces of violent reaction or violent revolution are so much more determined to see through to achieve their objectives. Now, again, you recall, the objectives of that group were not what they said. The objectives of that group are to be understood in the reality, not the ideal. The reality was those millions and millions of deaths, the gulags, the collectivization, the terror under Stalin. This is all part and parcel of determinate wills wanting to escape the evil that preceded it by intensifying the amount of evil that it has done. And this is again why I am talking about original sin. We originate in violence. The more, though, that we try to follow through the violence to achieve a non-violent outcome, we, whatever group, determines that this lot of people are the enemy and must be destroyed, or this lot of people are the enemy and must be destroyed. The more we are caught up in these tragic circumstances, and the point I want to make is we are caught up in tragic circumstances. And simply using the language of rights to elevate us morally as if that somehow could really lift us out of the world, that's a fantasy. That's just crazy. Now, I will come back in a moment to why I think it is. There are times where rights talk makes perfect sense, and I don't want to deny that. But I am emphasising the idea that it is going to be some kind of cure-all, or, and here's my next point, that there is a generation who is so pure that it is unsullied by the violence of the past is insane. Let's take the concept entitlement now, because when my friend Chris asked me to speak about entitlement, and I said it's very much bound up with rights, he was very concerned about or interested in that aspect of the notion of entitlement, which is very, very common today. And that is that you have a group, very often young, but a group of people who believe that the world owes them, that they are owed something, that they have a right to things, that they are entitled to it. They have a right to education, they have a right to this, they have a right to that. And the question is, sure, if the society can deliver certain things, they can stake a claim to it. But the claim they're staking the claim that they are entitled to have an education or opportunity for work or whatever, is a claim, as I said, that only makes sense if it's delivered. So you have to look at what were the conditions that enable them to be in the situation where they can make a claim that all sorts of goods are passed their way. And the answer is, well, look at the history. And if you look at the history of Australia, the United States, Great Britain, Europe, Asia as well, but let's just focus on these because, in a sense, it's these countries, especially the developed Western countries, which are leading the charge in terms of this kind of talk about reality, which are leading the charge in terms of entitlement, and which also see themselves as leading the charge in terms of creating a morally better future. And in their leading the charge, the one thing that their critics are all too aware of, but which they seem blithely unaware of, is that one of the reasons they're making the claims is because they can. It's because they have the wealth, the security, and all the conditions that have come out of the plunder, the murder, the mayhem that has spawned them. And in thinking that they are beyond it because they don't like it, in thinking that they can shame those people in the past who held slaves, for example, yet they themselves are the product of a society in which slavery was a component. There can be an argument about to what degree it was a component, but that it was a component, or worse, and this is not something for Black Lives Matter, but worse, the absolute slaughter on such a scale of Native American Indians in the 19th century, that is absolutely breathtaking in the sheer numbers, the horror of that. But here's the thing, that can't be undone. That cannot be undone. And simply saying, let's have, I said in an earlier lecture that if you didn't understand the idiocy of reparations, then you're a fool. And I looked at that and thought, well, maybe I should spell out the bleeding obvious, and that is this. If you give a group of people today some money to pay for the past, kind of blood money, the fact is they will spend it. That's it. That's that. And whether they spend it wisely or not, are you going to decide how they must spend it? And if you decide how they must spend it, then are they still enslaved to you in some way? That's just a never-ending set of problems that is being generated by something that's not a solution. What may be a solution is better education. Sure, more opportunities for jobs, yes. But how they played out and how they're dictated, there's all sorts of arguments to be had that, some people think, oh, well, let's do it on the basis of affirmative action. I think that's a disastrous way to do it. I think it doesn't help in the long run. All it does is creates a bureaucracy that then has quotas to fill. And in fulfilling the quotas, they will find the people that suit their objectives, but all these other people won't make it. Affirmative action, as if, and when you've got a quota, well, what about those that don't fit into the quota? What about those that don't go through that pathway? There's so many problems with it. What about it when the money goes? So is it to be endless reparations? But then you're creating conditions of dependency. Anyone who's looked into the terrible tragedy that is behind our welfare dependency can see that what may sound like a good way of solving a problem quickly becomes just another bureaucratic mechanism to keep a people in servitude. That is not an answer. The fact that there may not be an easy answer does not mean that we should embrace easy answers as if they were the best answers. That's just not the way we should be operating. Okay. So, what I'm suggesting here is that if we take this theological concept, original sin, and reflect upon it, we may learn something. It's not even a philosophical argument. It's just an attunement, an awareness of the fact that our condition, our wealth that we have inherited as part and parcel of a society which has reached a degree of wealth, is such that we should be ready to accept that. No, let me say that again. That the degree of wealth that we obtained is not because or solely because of our own labours. It has been granted to us. In a sense, we have all been privileged. The term privilege was widely used in the French Revolution as a pejorative term against the aristocracy by the rising bourgeois. It was also then widely used also by Marxists, and in the 1960s by the youth movement, and it's used again today. In some sense, it's misused because everyone who has a relative access to who has relative degree of access, relatively good degree of access to the resources of a modern society has been privileged. And that, by the way, that includes people of all classes, races and genders. It's not equal, for sure. And in an earlier lecture I explained why it couldn't be equal. It may not be the best way it could be distributed. That's certainly true too. But exactly how to get the best way of distributing that, no one really knows the answer to that. What you do know is that in fact, a number of ways that are put out as if they would guarantee that, don't guarantee that. And they're not very good ways of achieving that. It's simply a substitution racket of the crap you get on your plate is really to be viewed as if it were the dream dish on your menu. But that's the way our world works. So, we in the Western world have been very privileged. We've done nothing for that. And one group can talk about another group being more privileged. They can do that. And some groups being underprivileged. That's a very interesting formulation there. Underprivileged. Being underprivileged means that various circumstances, perhaps from the class you were born, certainly the parents you were born into, the location of your birth, the opportunities available in that location, the class, especially when we're talking of members of the underclass, being born into a single parent family, if you're born to parents who are drug addicts or addicts of one sort or another. All of these things are very tragic conditions, and I don't rule out the prospect that the state may be able to intervene in some ways that helps. That is an issue of policy which requires sitting down and being carefully focusing upon what works and what doesn't work. And I don't want to. My argument is not against the welfare state under any cost. At any cost. That's not my argument at all. Welfare is an inevitable component of the modern state. But it is simply to point out that although there are a group of underprivileged, what has transpired in the Western world is an increasing number of people have come to present themselves as underprivileged by creating a demarcation between one group who magically are supposed to be the privileged, white male, here I am, white males are all supposed to be privileged, but we know that's not true. The white junkie, the white, homeless person, blah, 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 it's only the white. You quickly see how nauseatingly simplistic this is. And it comes from the word privilege being thrown around with gay abandon, as if everyone has the right to everything they want. And this, I think, is the underlying appeal, not articulated, but there in the ether, that everyone should have the right to whatever they want. Because the society, which means someone somewhere must be able to service it. And I'm reminded whenever I think about this, the formulation of it came from Karl Marx, I think the ultimate formulation. And that was, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Now, it's the second part of that, to each according to his needs, or her needs, or its needs, that is now part and parcel of this sense of entitlement. But when Marx framed it, he imagined a world in which spontaneous cooperation of labour would take place on a grand scale because there wouldn't be any bourgeoisie to appropriate the surplus produced, and people would just do stuff out of the love of doing it. This is absolutely nuts, and it's a kind of idea that flies in the face of everything we know about economic history and human history. But the second part of that shows a good enough understanding. Well, who's trained in political economy, and all political economists know human needs are pretty well infinite. So what we now live in is a time where our education, which is our ideological emphases within our education system are such that everybody in this world believes that if they're not privileged, they're underprivileged. And if they're not as privileged as others, then they have an entitlement to have more. But we come back to someone has to supply that. And here's where we see the terrible truth of this kind of rights talk. I have a right to something, you should provide it. But there's no provider. Then the state must find the provider. So the state must determine who provides what to whom. And I hope you can quickly see that this can swiftly become another kind of evil. And it is interesting that we can look back, though I'm astounded how little historical knowledge there is of the horrors of the communist system. And I think there's very good reasons, there's explainable reasons why a generation that grew up on the fantasies of the ideas of what could be delivered if the world ran according to the desires of an educated class who didn't want to have to deal with capital and investment and all of those things, and private property, who thought that they could destroy it. So they had these wonderful ideals, but the reality was grimy and bloody. And I think the class of people that helped defend the Russian Revolution, even who didn't live there, that their students simply tended to largely ignore or forgive. So that, for example, if you go to Netflix, you'll find a zillion things about Nazism and almost nothing about the horrors of communism. It's like it's just forgotten. Now, it's not as if we're going to reproduce that. But the problem with this rights talk is that it can only be delivered by the intensification of state power. And it's the intensification of state power which creates the conditions and circumstances where the rights are delivered but they're also taken away. And the perfect example of that today is the right to freedom of speech. And the lack of that right, or the inroads being made to take away that right, They're being taken away from universities, they're being taken away from all sorts of places. All sorts of people are being kicked out of jobs, people being deplatformed, blah, blah, blah. Just recently a guy got kicked out of Princeton. And the administrator, the president of the university, defended that because this person had been critical about Black Lives Matter. And that was not allowed, that was not tolerable. Because the narrative that had to be protected, that was the right narrative. So rights talk very quickly leads itself to right talk. And right talk is what those who are privileged and genuinely able to stake their claims, their entitlement claims, within the state and corporations, they're able to achieve their will. Thank you.